Welcome back to another edition of the Vandy Program. I have been looking forward to this for a long time. My online buddy Will Tanner is joining today, and he is one of the leading experts in the historical stuff that has happened in the continent of Africa. Specifically, we're going to talk about a couple of countries: what was Rhodesia and what is Zimbabwe. What was and still is, but under a different form, South Africa, and whether or not this is all gonna happen here in the USA. So, Will, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. So, I figured we'd start with maybe a quick introduction of who you are, where you are, and what you've been up to, and what brought you to where you are today as being kind of the expert on these subjects.
Yeah, so I'm from the American Southeast. I live in Virginia right now. Though I'll probably be moving for reasons unrelated to politics sometime here in the next month or so. But I got into Rhodesia by chance and happenstance when I was like 9 or 10. Sometime around then, this liberal journalist named Jeremy Scahill wrote a book about Blackwater that I think was just called Blackwater. And I happened to be walking through Barnes and Noble and thought the cover looked cool. So I bought that book and read it and thought Eric Prince was the coolest guy ever and that Blackwater was very cool as well. And through that, found Soldier of Fortune magazine, which, if you know anything about Soldier of Fortune, one of its big things back in the day was Rhodesia and the Rhodesian Bush War and covering it. Robert Brown, who I think still runs the magazine, but at least at the time did, was very much a fan of the Rhodesian cause and helped smuggle guns to the Rhodesians, where it was just a cool story all around. And so I got into it through that and kind of had it sitting in the back of my mind, just vaguely knowing about this white country in Africa that, or, from first impression, had fought the communists. And I found it very odd that America didn't help it fight the communists. And instead, from what I could tell initially, had worked to destroy it. So that was all kind of in middle school, maybe early high school, and then got distracted with other things, forgot about it for a bit, and ended up buying a copy back before it was extortionately expensive of Ian Smith's The Great Betrayal, because it popped up when I was looking for something else, and read that. And in it, Smith chronicles how Rhodesia was just systematically and continually betrayed by every Western power other than Portugal and Israel, and destroyed by egalitarian governments that hated Rhodesia for being successful. And, I read that and at the time was dealing with something where a guy with a group I'm involved with wanted to bring in Andy Young as a speaker. And Andy Young is one of the key civil rights leaders in America and was also really the leading edge of the Carter administration's effort to finally finish Rhodesia off in the late 1970s. And so at the same time I was dealing with this guy who wanted to bring the civil rights lunatic in, I was also reading about how that same civil rights loon, Andy Young, had murdered this country and led to multiple genocides, not just the white genocide for which Zimbabwe is known, but also the Gurukuhundi, I think that's how you pronounce it, but I could be way off there, in which the Matabele people were genocided by the Shona within Zimbabwe after Mugabe took over. Tens upon tens of thousands dead. And so I was just astounded that someone like Young would still be well regarded. And that really led me to study Rhodesia a lot further and get into talking about it more. And since then, I've just found that people are interested in it, but don't know about it much. And so I've kept studying it and have kept writing about it and talking about it because I think it really strikes a chord with Americans, as we can get into later, who see many of the same things playing out, if somewhat differently, here that played out in Rhodesia. It's spiritually very similar and rooted, I think, in the same sort of egalitarian-driven policies and mindset.
So, and I guess let's start there let's start with Rhodesia. And I guess the timeline, one of the things that I found interesting is I've been doing research on this subject, I'd say for the last couple of years. I've got a couple of books, one that I finished, one on the Bush War, and specifically Daryl Watt, that I keep trying to finish and I can't finish it. But the thing that jumps out at me is November 11th, 1965. So that was the Universal Declaration of Independence from the Crown. And correct me if I'm wrong, there have been only two countries that were able to declare independence from the United Kingdom, or whatever it was called at the time. One of those is Rhodesia and the other is the United States. So what's fascinating about, and maybe we can kind of start in this part of the timeline, because from 1965, from the UDI all the way up to 1979, when open elections and all of that kind of came into being, the Rhodesians fought pretty hard and were pretty successful at staving off the eventual demise of the country. Correct?
Yeah. So if you look at what happened, the couple years leading up to the unilateral Declaration of Independence in 65, which Smith issued right at the same moment as the World War I armistice, just as a thumb in the eye to the British. And also UDI, the document, was based on the American Declaration of Independence, just as another thumb in the eye of the British. Because they were very bitter over what had happened, which is that Britain had effectively promised them independence as part of the Commonwealth if they wanted it in the 1950s. And instead, they built this federation, which was Rhodesia, Zambia now, and Nyasaland, which I think is called Malawi now. And it was this attempt at building a real block of the empire in southern Africa that would have been quite successful because of Zambian copper and all the farmland in Rhodesia and Nyasaland. It could have been a successful thing, and the Rhodesians wanted to do that instead. And so that worked for a couple years, but then this decolonization mindset started taking over, and the Rhodesians were getting edgy about that because they didn't want to happen to them what was happening to the Kenyan settlers, who the Mau Mau's were just torturing to death. And the British government, after defeating the Mau Mau's, abandoned the Kenyans to them, which was this insane thing. And then the Belgian Congo crisis happened, where if you look into that, we don't really need to cover it in depth here. It was probably the most horrific case of decolonization in all of Africa, which is saying a lot because a lot of it was quite bad. But the Belgians had built this really flourishing jewel of empire in the Congo, and then were told they had to leave, and they didn't want to leave, so they just abandoned it one day, pretty much. And the communists took over. These rebels called the Simbas were active from like the 62 or 63 point to 1965, and it was just unimaginable horrors, really purely because of mass democracy in the Congo. Because what are you going to do when it's a bunch of, varying feuding tribes who hate each other? It was just a disaster. And so the Rhodesians saw that and said, well, we're not doing decolonization. Leave us alone. And the British kept trying to force decolonization on them and wouldn't let them leave the empire, which was drifting towards this decolonization moment, without them agreeing to majority rule, which was the central struggle of the Rhodesian Bush War. Be majority rule or responsible government, with responsible government being a form of limited democracy involving property rights and educational attainment to be able to vote, versus just mass democracy of letting everyone vote. And the Rhodesians pointed out that, hey, we're not corrupt. Our government's quite effective, actually. We have equal justice. There's no apartheid here. We're extremely prosperous, not only for Africa, but just generally. We have the highest literacy standards for blacks on the continent. The entirety of the tribal chief networks supports us and is represented in the government. So it's not like these people don't have any representation. This just works better than democracy would. And the British didn't buy any of it. There was a labor government in charge that was really hostile to any form of hierarchy. This was the same period as like 90+% death and income taxes in Britain because of the same government. And so the Rhodesians declared independence, and the British were very upset about it. So that's the backstory leading up to why the British were against them in the Bush War, because then Rhodesia had to find new allies. So they were originally working with Portugal, which Salazar was still in charge of, and they controlled Angola and Mozambique, which Mozambique bordered Rhodesia to the east and was really its outlet to the sea. And then, of course, there's the apartheid South African government that was on its side at this point. And so the Bush War that followed was, for the first 8 to 10 years, so 1965 into the early mid 70s. It was a relatively limited conflict. The Rhodesians started off trying to treat it like a police action, somewhat like the Malay emergency that the British had won about a decade earlier in Malaysia. And that went pretty well for the Rhodesians. They just struggled to get traction because, on one hand, they were able to guard their border with Zambia and, to a much lesser extent, Botswana, where the rebels were coming through, primarily through Zambia. And they were able to defeat them once they got in and stop them from doing much damage. But they also didn't want to anger the international community by invading Zambia and trying to wipe out the rebel bases, because they knew the double standard would be applied to them. We're sure it's okay for the Zambians to send terrorists to murder your civilians, but if you kill those terrorists in Zambia, then that's just a breach of sovereignty and is beyond the pale. So they knew about that and were trying to not upset people by doing that. And instead, they worked with the Portuguese to try and crush Frelimo, which was a communist organization in Mozambique. And so, for that initial period of the Bush War, a lot of it was spent dealing with minor rebel engagements in Rhodesia and helping the Portuguese, who are often pretty ineffective, in Mozambique and to a lesser extent Angola, is something of a forward deployed expeditionary force, kind of. And they did very well in that. Things changed in 1975 after heating up for the couple years before then, which is why it's kind of tricky to divide it at just the 75 point. But in any case, when Salazar died and then the government that followed him fell to the socialists in the Carnation Revolution, which was backed by the same American establishment that backed a lot of these leftist revolutions, the Portuguese decided to give up both Angola and Mozambique, and America worried that the Portuguese government was going to become communist at this point, actually. So it was quite a crisis, and Frelimo ended up taking over Mozambique, which was a big problem for the Rhodesians because they had been importing pretty much all of their oil through the port of Beira, which is down in southern Mozambique, and also had been working with Portuguese forces to try and crush the communists outside their border rather than letting the communists invade. And that mattered because the Mozambique-Rhodesia border is primarily land and is very hard to defend because it's just this open expanse of generally unpopulated land except by scattered farmsteads, whereas the Zambian border had a lot more water where it was easier to defend. So that hugely expanded the Bush War in 1975. And that's where a lot of the Bush War actions you hear about, so like the farmers fighting off rebels or the mines in the road and the convoys, or these fire force actions where Rhodesian troops were parachuting onto rebel groups, sometimes even 6 times a day from low levels. You can imagine the damage that did to one's knees, along with the cross-border invasions into Mozambique. All comes from this 75 to 79, 80-ish period. And the Rhodesians did struggle somewhat more during this period just because the conflict was so much expanded. You can imagine trying to say defend Texas from, because Rhodesia is about the same size of Texas, with a couple thousand people in the military. The Rhodesian military establishment was never very large. Frontline troops were, I think, under 20,000 for most of the war. And there was a large reservist force that could kind of respond to things, but not really. So imagine trying to defend Texas from tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of rebels with a few thousand guys. It's very difficult, particularly if you can't import technology, which they couldn't. They had a hard time getting aircraft, helicopters, even supplies for their military, because the South Africans betrayed them in 1975, working with Kissinger. So the Bush War in this later period was very intense and much more difficult for the Rhodesians, but they still performed quite well. And I think their kill-death ratio was somewhere in the 60 to 1 range. So it was an impressive effort, but they did struggle a lot more in the later parts.
One of the things that's rattling around in my head as you talk through the timeline is during all of this, and you can correct me on any of this that I haven't got correct, but during all of this time, sanctions against Rhodesia meant that they had to fend for themselves, not just militarily, but they had to grow all their own food. They had to you mentioned the Mozambique importing of oil and all of that, but they had to develop trading partners in light of all this with a somewhat hostile rest of the world that was trying to shut them out. And they were able to succeed at having a pretty prosperous, although insular by force, very prosperous economy, correct?
Yes, there's a great CIA report on this from, I think, 1970 or 1971 that talks about this, where the expectation was that sanctions would bring Rhodesia to its knees and this embargo would really teach the Ian Smith government that it couldn't get away with anything. But in reality, from 1965 to 75, Rhodesia was very, very prosperous. It had less of an inflation problem than the American or British governments. Just the economy did quite well, actually. The As you brought up with sanctions, what they had to figure out was who they could trade with, because for the initial period, everyone was on board with sanctions. It was actually the first mandatory case of UN sanctions ever, in which all member states in good standing had to participate. And so that made it difficult because that meant they could trade essentially with Portugal and South Africa at first, and then later Israel as it started helping them a little bit. And so they had to try and have like Greek, generally oil tankers, try and run a British naval blockade of Mozambique to deliver them oil. And the British Navy at this point was entirely incompetent, so that actually worked out pretty well, but it was still difficult. And they had to rely on South Africa to export their trade goods, which originally Rhodesian prosperity was built generally on tobacco. As the war started progressing, they switched more to wheat than tobacco, though they were still tobacco farmers. And so that was generally exported to South Africa, and then the South Africans would deal with selling it in exchange for giving the Rhodesians military supplies, imports, that sort of thing. If you talk to people who are living in Rhodesia during this period, the general impression I get is that the economy was prosperous and that like no one had to go without things that they had already had. But there wasn't a ton of variety. So there'd be like one option of toothpaste in the store, but the toothpaste was there, is how someone described it to me. And, you know, they were a nation under siege, so that worked out, but it did place a great deal of stress on the population.
So the Ian Smith is an interesting story because he was probably the right guy at the right time. And tell me what you learned about him, his background leading up to this, and I guess his being a stalwart, especially at the tail end of the transition from Rhodesia into Zimbabwe.
Yeah, so he's a fascinating guy. His family was Scottish and immigrated to Rhodesia pretty early on in the process. And he ended up being a Spitfire pilot during World War II. He was shot down, was running around with guerrillas to escape from the Germans, he was wounded, but managed to make it back. It's a fun story. And so he was a war hero, and then he came back and was a successful politician. He was also a pretty prosperous and successful farmer. Not of huge wealth, like a couple people in Rhodesia were. The Duke of Montrose, for example, left England for Rhodesia because he was tired of the egalitarian policies. But, you know, Smith was still a large planter. There's a lot of overlap between the Rhodesians and the Virginians if you look at our revolutionary history and Rhodesia's history, just in terms of how society functioned and what sort of thing Rhodesian culture prioritized. And one thing you find is that these Rhodesian farmers in particular had the same sort of habit of command or intuitive sense of leadership authority that the Virginians were originally remarked for having. This is a comment Henry Adams had made about Robert E. Lee's son. They had the Virginians had this habit of command about them. The Rhodesians did too, which is why most of them were officers, both in World War I and World War II. They're just good at it. And that is a striking period of the striking aspect of the Bush War period, is that you had these guys who were really good leaders in charge. They kind of knew what to do and how to do it. They didn't end up winning because the whole world was crushing this country of 250,000 whites and a couple million blacks, which didn't work out in the end. But they made a very good effort of it. As you pointed out, Smith was just the right guy for the right time because he was articulate. He had a vision of what he wanted that was quite in line with what pretty much every white Rhodesian and most of the black Rhodesians wanted, which was responsible government. It was this idea that as blacks advance and these people who had been living in the Stone Age until 1890 gradually come out of that and learn how to function in a industrializing world with modern agriculture, modern mines, large cities that are essentially Western cities. They need to be able to function to participate in the governance of this country. And so the solution was responsible government, where if you showed you were a steward of your own life, you could participate in the stewardship of the country through participation in the electoral process. And yeah, Rhodesia had good leaders, and Smith really represented that. And so the wartime government, even if unpopular at times, because sometimes the Rhodesians thought wasn't quite harsh enough in dealing with the rebels, it waited to strike into Mozambique. It didn't really strike into Zambia until too late in the war for that to matter. It was always willing to negotiate with the British and Americans and South Africans rather than just telling them to get bent. Smith was just good at it. And as the war ended, he had been saying, hey, we can't have black majority rule because that's going to be a disaster. And he was warning of this and telling people about it. But then by the time it happened, because really of the British and the Carter administrations working with the Soviets and the Red Chinese to destroy Rhodesia in 79 and 80, he stayed in the country despite Mugabe taking over because he thought, well, I was in charge of it during the war and I lost, so it's my duty to stay behind and try and at least mitigate some of the worst things that Mugabe might do and continue leading my country into whatever world it's headed into. And that, it's hard to tell how much that really worked, but I think it was, for one, a good lesson in leadership, and also it probably did help initially ameliorate some of Mugabe's worst tendencies. For example, the land expropriation that Zimbabwe is famous for didn't happen until the late 1990s. For the first 15, 20-ish years of Mugabe's rule, the British worked with the Zimbabweans to provide funds to buy out white farms for the benefit of blacks in Zimbabwe. And I think Ian Smith was, if not instrumental, at least useful in helping keep Mugabe on that path rather than the outright expropriation path, which, it was unideal to live there, but did help Zimbabwe somewhat in those initial years and helped prevent the worst things that could have come with decolonization from happening. So I think it was quite brave of Smith to do that, and he showed his leadership skill and his internal fiber tremendously as it happened. And yeah, he's just an interesting guy and was a very good leader and quite what the Rhodesians needed to last as long as they did, despite the odds they faced.
Yeah, and we'll put a link on the channel to an interview that I know we've talked about this on X before, the interview that he did with William F. Buckley. That is just, I'm struck by Smith's calmness in his leadership. He's very poised and not at all a hothead when there would be opportunities to become one. But you mentioned, and it's a weird sentence to hear out loud, but you mentioned that Rhodesia had to fight against the Americans, the Soviets, the Red Chinese, and at some point that you're going to lose if that's if that's what you're up against. So right around this time, 79, 80 or so, we actually had a transition over here from, Carter to Reagan, or 81 to Reagan. And give me a sense, if you could, of when Rhodesia went from being Rhodesia to being Zimbabwe and Mugabe taking over, and how that unfolded over the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, so for the majority of the Bush War, it was just the Rhodesian Front government in charge, which was essentially the government that was backed by the white voting population and then the tribal chiefs who represented the majority of black village opinion, because the villagers didn't really vote. They just had these chiefs, and then the chiefs represented them in government. And that went pretty well. It was a good government. But the British and Americans kept insisting that though the chiefs were involved, that didn't represent black opinion, because there was this black working class and middle class of a couple 100,000 people that lived in the cities. And if it didn't make the incomes required to vote or have the wealth required to vote, then it was unrepresented. And so, despite being a minority of a very small minority of blacks in the country, they weren't represented. And that meant this government wasn't representative. So, independence couldn't be allowed. And Smith kept arguing that wasn't true and saying, we've done polling. You can come check our polling. Everyone likes my government, except for a few 100,000, most of whom are communists. But that wasn't working. It wasn't an argument that America or Britain would accept, and the communists just wanted communism. So in the late 70s, he had to kind of bow to what the world wanted because Rhodesia was running out of men as people left the country. It was running out of supplies as South Africa refused to supply it with what it needed because South Africa in this period, like America, was focused on détente with communism rather than trying to defeat communism. And so the initial solution was Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, which was this attempt to fuse the preferred white form of governance, of this responsible government, with having more black representation and having a black, ostensibly head guy in charge. The one they chose was Bishop Abel Muzorewa. I can never pronounce his name. It's one of those names I just can't do. Sorry. But he was a moderate. Generally, he was more radical than Smith would have liked, but certainly better than Mugabe or Nkomo. And he was pretty popular. So the Rhodesians figured, well, if we have an election that's a fair election, then the world governments will have to just accept that and let us have independence. And if we have a moderate in charge we can work with, then a lot of this won't go too badly, and perhaps we can still get some variation of responsible government. So they held this election. It was a fair election. They brought in British observers. It was universally remarked upon as being fair and representing the actual opinion of white and black Rhodesians who weren't communist terrorists. And the British advisor said, yeah, that's what happened. And Muzorewa won. He was going to be in charge. It was this new nation of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. It should have worked out. But both Nkomo and Mugabe started raising Cain because they said, well, we weren't represented and we want our men to be able to vote. And then the British government was transitioning from a temporary conservative one back into a Labour government that was just terrible, and then back into the Thatcher government, which was a conservative one in 1980. So the British government was in crisis over this late 70s period and just ineffective. Also run by incompetents who were far too favorable to communism, much like the American government in this period. And so they bought Mugabe's argument. And despite this functional, representative, more or less moderate black government being in charge in 1979, they said that's unacceptable. You have to redo the elections and you have to let Mugabe run, excuse me. And so Mugabe did run, and this was the 1980 election, which was universally remarked upon as not being fair at all. Instead, Mugabe demanded demilitarization of the elections, which he somehow convinced Nkomo to comply with. So Nkomo's men were unarmed, as were Muzorewa's supporters. The white Rhodesian government was still kind of fighting communist terrorists, but it was a muddled situation, and Mugabe just kept all of his men armed after pushing for disarmament and sent them to terrorize the villagers into voting for him. So a lot of the usual things you get out of African one man, one vote, one time elections of chopped off hands and murdered children and all the rest happened here. Surprise, surprise, Mugabe won after terrorizing the country into voting for him. The British said this is an unfair election, but we just want to wash our hands of the situation and be done with it. So whatever, Mugabe wins, let's move on. The Rhodesians had planned on assassinating Mugabe if he won. It was a kind of last minute plot put together by groups like the Celis Scouts and a few others in the security establishment. The problem was that the chief of Rhodesian intelligence was a traitor who was working with the British throughout the war, actually, which is part of the reason the Rhodesians lost. And he had provided the British with advance intelligence of this plot to kill Mugabe. So the assassination didn't work out because Mugabe was a no-show. And then the coup that the Rhodesians had planned if Mugabe won kind of sputtered and didn't happen because they just gave up in frustration at all the things that were going wrong and didn't try it and ended up just leaving for South Africa instead. And so that happened. That all happened right in 1980. Mugabe took over. A lot of whites fled and left for South Africa. Some tried staying behind. And, Mugabe was a tyrant. He disarmed the country. He did the Gurukundi and killed a lot of the Matabele. But things were prosperous enough because sanctions were lifted and international governments were investing in Zimbabwe to show that they were anti-racists or something. For the first while, and Britain particularly was involved with kind of helping Mugabe along, particularly for the first decade, because the Cold War was still going on, and Thatcher and Reagan, though I think not great in many ways, were at least somewhat willing to combat communism. And so that state of relative prosperity lasted until the early 90s. And then the British stopped funding Zimbabwe, which is when Mugabe started becoming more tyrannical. And so initially he looted the treasury to pay his former troops a bonus. But then that money ran out and there was inflation. So then he started confiscating white land, and then he confiscated all the white land. So really the Zimbabwe that people think of, to get to the end of my answer to your question, came in the late 90s and first decade of the 2000s as the land expropriation really happened and Mugabe was really a tyrant. And then he was later overthrown, or he died, and his wife was overthrown by the army in the late 2010s.
So, and all of this is a good transition to what happened in South Africa, because South Africa's story probably goes back quite a bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk about, what are my notes? Kind of a 1961 independence from the crown, but still an apartheid government. And then 94, April 27th of 94 was when, and in no small reason that this happened was because the Soviet Empire collapsed. So support for South Africa collapsed, and they had to open up elections, democracy, and all of that happened. But all of this, it seems to the outside observer that they might have paid at least a little bit of attention to what happened in Rhodesia and to Zimbabwe, or to Rhodesia and in Zimbabwe post democracy or post democratic elections, and tried to figure out a way for it not to happen the same way. But in the 32 years of South African independence, it's been pretty bleak.
Indeed.
So I don't know where to start with this, but maybe 94 onward, it might be a good place to begin, kind of juxtaposing South Africa with Rhodesia and Zimbabwe.
Yeah. So South Africa was a little more complicated than Rhodesia because, for one, there was a much larger white population, but also it had more of a history of self-government compared to Rhodesia, which had been governed by the British South Africa Company into the 20s, and then after then kind of had independent government as part of the empire. And so anyway, South Africa had been largely governed by the Afrikaners despite ostensible British rule even after the Boer War. And it wanted that and it got it. And then it alternated, somewhat unlike the Rhodesians, which were very steady as you go, responsible government types. South Africa alternated between hardliners and then just idiotic leftists. So for the 60s is when you really think of apartheid being this harsh system that they were imposing. And then in the 70s, you had this horrible government that was interested in détente. It wasn't like Carter, who was just abominable, but it betrayed Rhodesia because it wanted détente with communists in Mozambique. It weakened in a lot of ways. It was this horrible government. And then in the 80s, it got hardliners again, and they were fighting the communist Angola. They convinced Reagan to help them do that, which was surprising. They were enforcing apartheid again. They kept Mandela in prison, though they wouldn't execute him. And that continued through the 90s, and that angered whatever good they might have accomplished with détente, which I don't think was much, was undone in the 80s because they were back to being this just horrible government. Not that I would say it was horrible. Apartheid was actually pretty lax, as Reagan pointed out during this period. In any case, they were hated by the international community for being those evil South Africans that are doing all these mean things to communists, which was left out. And that meant that sanctions were really imposed on the South Africans. And unlike Rhodesia, who had at least had Portugal and South Africa and Israel, and to a lesser extent, Italy and France to turn to for a while, South Africa didn't really have anyone because it didn't want to work with the Chinese communists. The Soviet Union was a no go, and then Russia was in crisis. And America was certainly a no go, despite Reagan's attempts to ameliorate some of this. Congress was saying, no, we have to crush South Africa. So sanctions really did start biting South Africa in the late 80s, particularly as it was fighting this war with Angola, which was very expensive for at least it to manage. Um, it it just started having financial problems. Inflation was horrible. It was not running out of goods, but it was kind of in the same state of siege as Rhodesia, where goods were limited and people didn't feel that prosperous. There was an internal bombing campaign against white civilians being carried out by Mandela's Spear of the Nation terror group, which was affiliated with the ANC. South Africa didn't have any allies or much reason to hope that things would get better. So then in 1991, or the early 1990s, they started just giving up. The Cold War ended, so no one was interested in helping them anymore because there wasn't, as you mentioned, this communist menace to fight. They didn't have any allies they could turn to, or really nations that they could hope would just trade with them and ignore the apartheid thing. And so they just started giving up, and they got a weak guy, much as they'd had in the 70s, who was willing to work with Mandela, who was a convicted terrorist who had helped murder civilians, and his wife was known for setting people on fire. But none of that mattered because he was talking about how much he loved peace. He did the usual thing that communists do, where they pretend that they're walking their positions back and they're going to work with you and be reasonable, and you just have to give them a little bit, and then it'll be okay, and you can move forward. So he did that whole routine that the Soviets had done for decades. And much as everyone had bought the Soviet thing for decades, they bought Mandela's thing. And so he came into power on this claim that rather than being a tyrant like Mugabe, he was going to respect the Constitution, and they were going to get rid of these racial laws, and it would be the Rainbow Nation and everyone would be happy. Somewhat like Zimbabwe, that might have been true for a couple years, and things generally weren't that bad in South Africa in the second half of the 90s. But then as Mandela left and died, and more of the hardliner ANC types started taking over, though it should be said, this process that I'm about to describe began under Mandela. He just was lesser known for it because he was better about optics. All of the sorts of things one would expect from a race communist government started being reimposed on South Africa. So, for example, you get black economic equity legislation, which if you imagine whatever you think DEI is, just take that and multiply it by 1,000 and then make it actually enforced everywhere all the time. So, for example, white companies had to start giving up shares of their company to various blacks in the name of equity, which typically meant just ANC kleptocrats were being given large blocks of large companies. Hiring has to be proportional to race. So, if you need 20 competent engineers, that generally means you have to hire like hundreds of people because there are so many blacks there who don't know how to do the job, and then a couple competent whites and a couple competent blacks, where it's just a disaster to do hiring. Crime isn't punished because of the disparate impact thing, where crime really started rocketing out of control. There's so much corruption in government, no one really does their job. And so, utilities start collapsing. The police are ineffective if they're not actively on the side of criminals. It's just this disaster. And so that really started as the ANC found its feet and had started implementing some of these laws without enforcing them as much, and then it started really enforcing them and passing new laws, where today South Africa has more racial legislation than the apartheid South African government did at its height. And that's South Africa has gone how you would expect with all of that in place. The whites have been largely impoverished. The country is in a continual state of crisis, trying to deal with not having reliable electricity, not having reliable water, crime being out of control. It has a higher homicide rate than Somalia. which has pirates and a pirate stock exchange. It's just it is insane situation of anarcho-tyranny, and that's really Mandela's legacy. And so to answer your question, they did try to make that not happen by working with Mandela, who they thought was reasonable. But the problem was that they were just falling for a bit, much as people always fall for a bit. So the Constitution didn't matter. These promises and pledges and extractions didn't matter. It was just exactly what you'd expect, having looked at Rhodesia happening and all the guarantees that they got that that's not what would happen were false guarantees. But because of the sort of people they had in charge at the time, this very weak last government, and just international pressure, meaning they had to make a deal because everyone was being impoverished and they couldn't find anyone to work with. They went along with it, and it turned out very badly.
So South Africa is not a good place right now, and there seems to be more discussion, especially online, and with the white farmers being murdered, and then the war of narrative on, well, is it happening? No, it's not happening. Well, yeah, it's happening a little bit. That whole trope. The the question I have for, I guess for you about South Africa is, now we realize that Zimbabwe in its current form is, let's say, beyond repair. Is South Africa fixable, or is that also at the point where it's beyond repair?
Yeah, so Zimbabwe, for example, right now is very poor, but it's not in a horrible place because relations between whites and blacks in Zimbabwe were actually quite good for pretty much all of its history. Because it didn't have apartheid, and because the Rhodesians were generally pretty like reasonable and responsible people who treated their laborers well, there wasn't that legacy of like hatred and animus, which is part of the reason why there wasn't like a Congo-style genocide in Zimbabwe. So now that Mugabe's out of the way, Zimbabwe is actually kind of rebuilding. White farmers have come back. They're making the economy function somewhat again. It's doing okay. It's not great, but it's doing okay, and it has hope of getting better. South Africa, in contrast, and why I brought Zimbabwe Rhodesia up, is has the legacy of everyone hating each other, which makes it very difficult to do anything because there's very little goodwill, at least in a large part of the country. This is, of course, not always the case with certain farmers and their laborers, but as people like Tim Bax, who was a Rhodesian who left for South Africa, noted in his book Three Sips of Gin, there was this really surprising amount of just hate and dislike between the Afrikaners in particular, and then some of the black ethnic groups, like the Xhosa in South Africa, which makes it hard to do much. The other things that South Africa is a huge country, and a lot of these groups are spread out, where whites are not dominant, but much more populous in the Western Cape region. The Xhosa, which are one of kind of the original groups, are in the south and to the east. The Zulus came in from the north, and so they're still kind of up there along with some whites, where it's this fractious situation, kind of, yeah, it's hard to compare it anywhere, but imagine like North and South in America or something, where you have the Cavaliers and Puritans slugging it out eternally. Though that's a simplification. The South Africa has some of that, which makes things difficult. Also, just an insanely kleptocratic government that has looted everything, which makes it hard to rebuild because you're poor and everything's gone now. And not only is it gone, but everything's ruined as well, which makes rebuilding even more difficult. People dislike each other, so there's very little goodwill you can use to build anything going forward. You just have to expect that it's going to be stolen or ruined. So that's a much tougher situation than somewhere like Zimbabwe. The other thing is that in Zimbabwe, reconstruction or rebuilding has worked out a little bit because the whites were invited back in by the black government and can work with them. Whereas in South Africa, for one, that's never going to happen. And so the only real hope of things getting better is somewhere like, say, the Western Cape seceding and just running itself as a, if not white majority, at least generally white governed area that's able to rebuild and then maybe expand outward. But up until this presidency, that's the sort of thing that was just unimaginable because the moment anything like that was suggested, much less happened, an American carrier group would show up and bomb the white rebels for being mean and just let the race communists take over because that's the sort of thing that had been inflicted upon South Africa and places like it forever. And so there's very little hope of that happening. Now, I mean, if the Western Cape broke away, Trump might support it based on his interactions with the South African government, which would be great, but I don't think he'll provoke that. And as more Afrikaners leave through refugee programs and come to America, which really the one group of refugees that America is allowing in right now are Afrikaners, which is incredible, a huge just change in policy. And that's great for those who leave, but it also makes it even harder for the ones who stay behind to do anything. So, I really doubt that South Africa will much recover. It could. If you look at what Mike Hoare did in the Congo, where this small column of mercenaries essentially retook the country from huge numbers of rebels just because they knew how to fight and the rebels didn't, and they were organized and the rebels never could be. The same sort of thing could happen in South Africa. The Western Cape could blitz out and retake the country and just decide to rule it again, and it would do a great job, probably, if it did that. I just don't think that'll happen. No one really has the willpower to make it happen. The international community would be outraged. There's no Cold War justification for letting it happen. It's really the only path to any sort of renewal on a grand scale. I could see somewhere like the Western Cape seceding or having a soft secession where it just does more what it wants as the central government continues to decline and be ineffective, which is really the one saving grace. This is my last part of my answer to your question. I know I've gone on for a while. The saving grace for agentic whites in South Africa and those blacks that they can work with, the Zulus are actually pretty good on some of these issues, is that the government is so ineffective and incapable and continually degrading itself by being this just insane kleptocracy that if you can fly below the radar, so if you're not just a major company like Excom, then you can kind of do things and get away with it, and there's a limited chance that the government's going to come crush you. So Orania, for example, technically has constitutional protections that let it exist, and it's this Afrikaner-only town in the desert. But what really helps Orania continue existing is that it's detached from everything because it's out in a desert that it's made blossom, but is nevertheless still a desert. And it's pretty small, so it flies below the radar, at least generally. And there's just no willpower in the South African government to deal with it. No one cares that much. And so that sort of thing can succeed. And for the people who live there, life is actually quite pleasant. And the same sort of thing kind of exists in a less obvious state in a lot of the rural areas, in particular in the Western Cape, where people are able to function and have good lives. And I suspect that sort of thing will continue happening and will be the path to renewal or at least survival in some parts of South Africa moving forward. But I don't think a national renewal will come pending just some impossible to predict sea change that makes retaking the country by a force of arms possible and actually happen.
But this Orania example you're talking about, that's what, 20,000 people?
Less than that. It's
Yeah.
quite small, which is why it's flown below the radar.
Yeah, and so even if you have a few more of these pockets like that, it would take a lot of pockets like that to get to a point where you've got something that's long-term viable for change in the country, to your point. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about all this is not just your knowledge of where these two countries have evolved, and you say a lot of this sort of thing on your X account, the fact that we might be heading toward a South Africanization in the U.S. And I guess can you explain a little bit about why you might say, why somebody might think like that, and what can be done to stem off that possibility?
Yes.
Here.
So first, to set expectations of what can happen in America, though it's not happening at this moment, the 1970s saw thousands upon thousands of bombings There was an urban black guerrilla network called the Black Liberation Army that worked closely with the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground. And we had an active, ongoing terror campaign against really functional white people, bankers, police officers, suburban Americans, and the like, that lasted for a decade and was mostly unpunished. Very few of the Weather Underground people faced jail time. Some of the Black Liberation Army types were killed by police officers who were more willing to deal with this, but the federal government didn't do anything about them. Same with the Black Panthers. And so that was allowed because Carter was a communist and Ford was ineffective. And, Nixon didn't deal with it for his own reasons. And so that can happen in America. Just to, set expectations about how bad things can get. It ended up not flowering into a full revolution, but nevertheless, it happened. South Africanization is the process by which that happens just on a grand scale and is applied to things besides crime. But particularly, you have this intersection of race communist economic policies and then anarcho-tyranny on the law and order front. So to describe both, and they do intersect a great deal. Race communism is this term that I didn't invent. I forget who I got it from, but it's a useful descriptor because originally communism was this economic system. It was the idea that we're going to redistribute property and there's going to be state ownership and, it'll be great. No one really cares about that anymore. People don't care about the economic system that much. What they do care about is the redistribution of wealth from whites in particular, but really anyone who's a functional person, to the teeming underclass, the favela inhabitant, the Section 8 inhabitant, in the name of equity and racial justice and racial redistribution. And so any economic policy that often smacks of communism or socialism isn't about the policy itself, it's about the redistribution. And so in South Africa, you've seen that happen. And it's particularly not just about the redistribution, but about inflicting pain upon the supposed oppressor class as the redistribution is carried about. And so in South Africa, you see this with the BEE legislation that I described earlier. In Zimbabwe, you saw it with expropriation of white farms, which you're now starting to see happen in South Africa. In America, you see it in a lot of kind of hidden ways. For example, the Dwayne Geld problem, as I call it, which is the American Great Society-related welfare state and its attendant programs, costs us $2 trillion a year. The entirety of the national deficit, if you just segment it off, is spent on these racial redistribution programs that really don't benefit productive taxpayers, but do benefit the criminal underclass. Medicaid, income security that is never really for people who produced an income, in the like. It goes to that, and so that's a huge amount of money. But that's just it's the easiest part to discern. You also have the fraud that we've been seeing, which really only seems to go to people who are never productive people. You have huge instances of criminality applied to economic policy. For example, squatters. In a lot of blue states, squatters have more rights than the people who own the home in which they're squatting, which is just expropriation in a different guise. If some vagrant can take over your $1 million house just by being in it while you're out of town, that's a problem, and that exists in most of America. That can just happen to you, and there's very little you can do about it. And so that sort of thing has happened hugely. And then finally, you're starting to see some instances of attempts at expropriation. Cranberry Farm in New Jersey, fortunately, that was defeated because of the Trump administration getting involved. But if you look up what happened, it was this multiple century owned, I think, family farm. It was over 100 years old, family farm. It might have been 200 years old. That they raised sheep on it. They wanted to keep their farm. The city was trying to take it from them to turn it into slum housing for the criminal underclass in the city. And that almost happened. It was like a court case away from happening, and only didn't because Trump made it stop, or Brooke Rollins made it stop. And so that happens in America, and that's race communist economic policy. It's already bad, but it can get far, far worse. As you were starting to see glimmers of under Biden, for example, SpaceX being sued for not hiring Haitian refugees to design rockets, that actually happened. So that's the economic part. The anarcho-tyranny part, which has also happened in South Africa and is happening in America, is this combination of anarchy on one hand, where the criminal underclass, gangsters, kind of known criminals can get away with whatever they want. So you see this in examples in Chicago. Chicago gangsters are known for posting videos online of themselves with fully automatic machine pistols. They'll put a switch on the back of a Glock that turns it automatic, which is it's a very serious felony in America, whether it should be or shouldn't be, whatever. It is. They're never punished. There's been like one case of the ATF going after black guys for illegal firearms. And despite them posting all of this on the internet with their faces. But the other part, and that applies to all sorts of criminality, criminals are never dealt with, really. And then the tyranny part of anarcho-tyranny is that all the regulations, plus many more, that aren't enforced against the known criminal class is enforced against the productive, law-abiding, industrious American class. So if you're someone like me, which I've never done this, and I won't do this for this reason, and you put a switch on the back of a Glock pistol that turns it fully automatic, the ATF will come after you and will ruin your life and will take everything you have. It's just a known thing that's going to happen. Similarly, as was going on Twitter today, the Coast Guard can just show up to your boat in the ocean and hop on and investigate it and look and try and find a reason to ruin your life. They never do that to the Section 8 inhabitants, the favela world inhabitants. That sort of thing is just never done to them. Similarly, if you're a business, you're going to face extreme levels of regulation. You're taxed very heavily. The IRS is always looking for a reason to audit you, which is why I always pay my taxes in full and without doing much tax avoidant or doing, anything illegal, because I know the IRS will come for me if I try and do that. Whereas the gangsters who are raking in millions of dollars a year selling crack for cash, they never face any consequences for that, and certainly don't face the IRS coming after them. And so that sort of anarcho-tyranny, where the law-abiding citizen is crushed by regulation and malicious enforcement at the same time as known criminals are allowed to do whatever they want, that has ruined South Africa. It's why the country is as bad as it is in terms of violent crime and farm murders and just economic scleroticism. And it already exists to a large extent in America. It's just you can kind of avoid it if you live in a nice area where the police aren't around as much. But you always have to be on the lookout for it. So it's a big problem. In the combination of those two things, the narco-tyranny and the race communism, for one, they intersect, because how is race communism enforced? Well, it's through the tyranny part of narco-tyranny. It's through this just malicious prosecution and regulation and taxation and so on. They will ruin a nation, because who is going to invest, not buy stocks, but I mean, like, actually invest in anything if they know this is going on? Are you going to invest in making your neighborhood a nicer place? Are you going to build close relationships with people if you know you're going to have to leave if some blockbusting realtor starts moving criminals into your neighborhood to try and make a quick buck ruining it, as happened in most American cities in the 1960s and 70s? No. If you're Ford, are you going to try and do what Henry Ford originally did and build a pretty nice community in which workers can live? Or are you just going to try and squeeze the lemon, offshore stuff, try and get it out of the prying eyes of the American government so that you can at least make money for a bit longer and try and avoid a lot of this? Well, of course, it's the latter. And that is happening on a grand scale as people try and deal with and avoid this. And it shreds every community bond that used to exist. It makes it impossible for long-term thinking to come into play, and it just makes people's lives miserable, and there's the attendant effects of crime and tyranny that are degrading to the spirit and often harmful to the body as well. And so, all of that happened in South Africa. It's happening in America. It's just to a somewhat lesser extent here for now.
So I guess to close this out, what next, and what would you advise people that want to know more about all of these subjects?
Yeah, so for what next, I think a large reason this has been allowed to happen is that the sort of people who should be involved in government weren't for most of the 20th century. If you look at, I talk about Rhodesia and Virginia because they did have this class of men who were wealthy and who cared not about influencing the government, but about actually participating in the government and making things happen. So, George Washington was a very powerful and wealthy landowner, and he used that not to put some like malicious bureaucrat in charge, but to like actually run and participate in state government and local government and the national government and do all the things. And that stopped in the 20th century, I think in large part because the Northern WASP class lacked a lot of the publicly applied virtue that the Virginians in particular had. And also just taxation and stuff made them kind of hostile to America and hostile to the American worker for reasons of death taxes and trade unions in particular. Anyway, it wasn't a good situation and they tuned out. And so now that sort of person isn't involved in government. And there's not really anyone who filled the gap in terms of like doing local and state government is the sort of person who's going to be involved with it for the long term because you're stuck there and you care about your community and you care about the people in it. And that's been a huge problem because it's what has allowed a lot of this to happen, where most of these ill effects I described, though not all, but most can be ameliorated by just like competent and non-malicious local government and state government. The IRS and the EPA are somewhat separate matters that are bad, but if you're worried about having your head cut off by a cannibal, it helps a lot if your sheriff is a good guy in terms of making that not happen. And it's even better if you're friends with the sheriff and you helped elect him, or maybe it's you, or your state legislators aren't involving themselves in refugee admission schemes or H-1B schemes. All of this, a lot of this can be handled with prudent, non-malicious government at the state and local level. But to get that requires it requires a gentry of sorts that actually trains itself in government, is competent at government, and involves itself in government, like we had in Virginia or like Rhodesia had. And so rebuilding that is a big thing, and why I focus on that on Twitter and Substack as well. But just in the short term, if you're looking to avoid a lot of this, you can avoid it by living in a state like Tennessee or Florida instead of New York or Illinois or California, because a lot of the things that can be kind of held off are being held off, particularly if you don't live in a big city. So like squatters' rights aren't really a thing in the deeper red states. The anarchy part of anarcho-tyranny isn't as much of a thing in most of them. The police actually will deal kind of with criminals, particularly if you're not in a big city. So you can, I would say, avoiding a lot of this is a must and can be achieved by prudent relocation. And you can do your own research about where it fits you best. If you're interested in learning more about this, I write about it pretty frequently in my Substack, the American Tribune.news, and also post about it on Twitter at Will_Tanner_1. There's also a lot of reading you can do. One thing I would caution is that there isn't a good general history of Rhodesia. Peter Baxter wrote one called Rhodesia, A Complete History, and it's okay. It's not great. It's not bad, but it's just not great. There's not really another one that's any good. There's a lot of memoirs from the Bush War, but those will just give you insights into how the Bush War was fought. Tim Bax's Three Sips of Gin describes a little bit more about Rhodesian and South African society, and I think is the best written of the memoirs. Fire Force is one that's recommended a lot, but I didn't particularly like it. I didn't really like the writing style or much of the story. So, I'd recommend checking out some of the memoirs if you're interested in the Bush War. But the best place to read about a lot of this is either by listening to interviews of veterans or just by reading what people on the internet have produced about it. Zoomer Historian did a pretty good History of Rhodesia video series on his Substack. And that's generally the best way to learn more about it in depth rather than searching up books, because right now there aren't a great selection of books on it.
Will Tanner, this has been really fascinating. I appreciate your time. A lot to digest here, but thanks so much for hopping on the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.